55% of the calories Americans eat come from ultra-processed food. Frozen dinners with ingredient lists longer than a medieval tax record. Microwave meals engineered in laboratories by food scientists whose job is to make you eat more, not eat better. The average American spends over $300 a month feeding themselves, and more than half of that goes to products their great-grandparents would not recognize as food. Meanwhile, a medieval peasant fed an entire family on 3 ingredients per meal. Not because they were primitive, because 3 ingredients was all it took when the ingredients were real. Today, I'm going to show you 15 forgotten medieval meals, each made with 3 ingredients or fewer, that kept working families alive through winters, famines, and plagues. Meals so effective that modern nutritional science is only now confirming what peasants figured out 800 years ago with nothing but a cauldron and a fire. Number 1. Peas pottage. The meal that fed all of England. Take dried peas, water and salt. That is the entire recipe. Medieval peasants soaked dried field peas overnight, then simmered them in water over a low fire for hours until the peas broke down into a thick, creamy mass. A pinch of salt finished it. This was not a side dish. This was dinner, lunch, sometimes breakfast. English manorial records from the 13th and 14th centuries list peas as the single most consumed legume among the labouring class. And for good reason. Dried peas contain over 20 grams of protein per 100 grams dry weight. That is more protein per weight than most cuts of beef. The slow cooking broke down the complex starches and neutralized the lectins that make raw legumes difficult to digest. A 2019 study from the University of Bristol, led by Dr. Julie Dunn, chemically analysed medieval cooking pot fragments from the village of West Cotton in Northamptonshire. The researchers used organic residue analysis to extract food signatures from pottery shards buried for over 500 years. The residue inside those pots confirmed what historians suspected. Legume-based pottages were the foundation of the peasant diet. For your kitchen, this means a bag of dried split peas, a pot of water, and salt. Cost: about $2. Cooking time: 2 hours of simmering you can ignore. The meal that built medieval England costs less than a fast food coffee. Number 2. Bread and dripping. Walk into a medieval farmhouse after the autumn slaughter, and you would find rendered animal fat stored in crocks near the hearth. When a peasant needed a fast meal, they spread that fat on a thick slab of bread and ate it with their hands. Bread, rendered fat, and a pinch of salt. The fat provided concentrated calories and fat-soluble vitamins A, D, and K that the body cannot absorb without dietary fat. A single tablespoon of beef tallow contains around 115 calories and virtually none of the industrial trans fats found in modern margarine. Modern nutritional science, particularly research published in the British Medical Journal in 2015, has confirmed that natural animal fats are not the health threat we were told they were for 50 years. The real threat turned out to be the ultra-processed seed oils that replaced them. Medieval peasants never had that problem. They rendered fat from the animals they raised, spread it on bread they baked, and moved on with their day. Number 3. Frumenti. The wheat porridge the entire continent relied on. Whole wheat, water and milk. That was frumenti. You took cracked or whole wheat grains, boiled them in water until they burst and softened, then finished the dish with milk. Recipes for frumenti appear in nearly every major medieval cookbook, from the form of curry compiled for King Richard II around 1390 to Le Ménagier de Paris from 1393. Wealthy households added saffron, eggs and sugar. Peasants ate it plain, and the plain version was arguably better for them. The slow boiling of whole wheat grains preserved the bran and the germ, delivering fibre, B vitamins and minerals that modern roller-milled flour strips away. For your breakfast, frumenti translates directly to what we now call whole grain porridge. buy whole wheat berries, simmer them for 45 minutes, add milk. You have just made a meal that sustained European civilization for 6 centuries. Number 4. Cabbage pottage. The vegetable stew you could make with your eyes closed. Cabbage, onions, and water. Chop the cabbage, slice the onions, throw both into a pot of water and let it simmer until soft. The former of Curie includes a recipe for cabbage pottage almost identical to this. Cabbage was the single most common vegetable in the medieval garden because it grew in poor soil, survived frost, and stored for months in a root cellar. A single cup of cooked cabbage provides more than 50% of your daily vitamin C and is loaded with fibre, vitamin K, and anti-inflammatory compounds called glucosinolates. Researchers at Wageningen University in the Netherlands have shown that brassica vegetables like cabbage have measurable anti-cancer properties at the cellular level. Medieval peasants did not know the chemistry. They knew that cabbage grew everywhere, lasted forever, and kept their families standing through winter. That was enough. Number 5. Bean pottage. The protein source that made meat optional. Dried fava beans, water, and onions. Fava beans were the dominant legume in medieval Europe. They grew in nearly any soil, fixed nitrogen back into the ground, and dried to a state where they could be stored for years without spoiling. Per 100 grams cooked, fava beans deliver about 7.5 grams of protein, nearly 8 grams of fibre, and significant iron, magnesium, and folate. A medieval family could feed themselves from a single sack of dried beans for weeks. A study published in the journal Legume Science in 2022 reviewed the nutritional profile of fava beans and found them comparable to or exceeding modern soy in several amino acid categories. The peasants who relied on bean pottage as their primary protein source were not suffering. They were getting a more complete nutritional profile than most Americans get from a drive-through window. Number 6. Sops. The zero-waste comfort meal. Take stale bread, pour hot broth over it, and eat. That is sops. From the 5th century through the 15th, sops were one of the most common meals in Europe. Stale bread was never thrown away. It was soaked in whatever liquid was available, whether that was meat broth, vegetable stock, or even warmed ale. The bread softened, absorbed the nutrients and fat from the broth, and became a filling, calorie-dense meal. This was the original no-waste cooking. Every scrap of bread served a purpose. Every leftover liquid became a vehicle for nutrition. The concept was so universal that the word sop shares the same Germanic root as our modern word soup. Modern food waste in the United States runs at roughly 30 to 40% of the entire food supply, according to the USDA. That is over 130 billion pounds of food per year going to landfills. Medieval households operating on 3 ingredients could not afford to waste a crumb, and they designed meals specifically to prevent it. Number 7. Oat porridge. The breakfast that powered manual labour. Oats, water, and salt. Pour oats into a pot of boiling water, stir until thick, add salt. Medieval labourers ate this before dawn and worked in fields until sundown. Oats deliver about 13 grams of protein per 100 grams dry, along with beta-glucan fibre that modern research from the Lund University in Sweden has linked to improved cholesterol levels and long-lasting satiety. The key is that medieval oats were not instant. They were whole or steel cut, which meant slower digestion, steadier blood sugar, and energy that lasted hours instead of spiking and crashing within 45 minutes like modern processed cereal. A canister of whole oats costs under $4 and lasts a week. Your box of brand name breakfast cereal costs $5 and lasts 3 days. A medieval peasant's breakfast was cheaper, more filling, and better for your blood sugar. The chemistry has not changed in 800 years. The markup has. Number 8. Turnip pottage. The root vegetable stew modern supermarkets forgot: turnips, water, and onions. Turnips were one of the most important root vegetables in the medieval garden. They grew fast, survived frost, and stored for months in cool conditions. The form of curry includes a recipe for turnip pottage that calls for diced turnips parboiled and then simmered in broth with onions. 1 cup of cooked turnips provides just 34 calories, but delivers vitamin C, fibre, and potassium. For peasants, turnips were the calorie bridge between harvests. When grain was low and meat was scarce, turnips filled the gap. Modern supermarkets barely stock them anymore because turnips cannot be processed, flavoured, and resold at a 300% markup the way a potato can. Number 9. Maslin bread and cheese. 2 foods that together form a complete protein. Maslin bread, which was made from a mix of wheat and rye, plus a slab of hard cheese, plus water. That was a standard midday meal for field labourers. English manor records describe this as the ploughman's lunch, eaten in the fields during the workday. The wheat-rye combination created a more complete amino acid profile than either grain alone. Adding cheese supplied the remaining essential amino acids that grains lack, particularly lysine. Modern reconstructions of Maslin bread recipes show significantly better moisture retention and mold resistance than pure wheat bread. The medieval peasant's lunch was nutritionally complete, shelf-stable, required no refrigeration, and cost almost nothing. Your sandwich from the deli counter costs $12 and was made with bread containing 25 ingredients. Number 10. Leek and barley stew. The healer's meal. Leeks, barley, and water. Medieval herbal texts consistently recommend leeks for respiratory ailments and digestive trouble. Barley was considered the most digestible grain, often given to the sick and the elderly. The combination simmered into a thick, nourishing stew that served as both food and medicine. Modern research has confirmed that leeks contain inulin, a prebiotic fibre that feeds beneficial gut bacteria. Barley's beta-glucan fibre supports immune function and lowers cholesterol. A study published in Nutrition Reviews by Oxford Academic confirmed that whole grain barley and oats produce measurable improvements in heart health markers and gut microbiota composition. Medieval peasants gave leek and barley stew to sick family members centuries before anyone understood what a prebiotic was. Number 11. Herb pottage or worties, foraged greens, water and salt. Medieval peasants gathered wild edible plants from fields, hedgerows and forest edges. Nettles, dandelion greens, sorrel, wild garlic and chickweed all went into the pot. These were boiled in water with salt to make wortes, the simplest and cheapest meal a peasant could produce. The cost was zero. The nutrition was extraordinary. Wild greens typically contain 2 to 10 times the mineral content of cultivated vegetables. Nettles alone contain more iron per gram than spinach. This was a meal that required no land, no rent, no seeds, and no permission from a landlord. It came from the earth for free. The fact that modern grocery stores charge $6 for a bag of pre-washed salad greens that were picked 2 weeks ago and shipped across the country should tell you everything about what we traded away. Number 12. Egg drop broth, the fastest hot meal in the medieval kitchen. Boiling water or broth, an egg and a pinch of salt. Crack an egg into simmering broth, stir, and you have a protein-rich meal in under 2 minutes. Variations of this appear across medieval European cooking, from English households to Italian kitchens, where it survives today as stracciatella. Chinese cuisine developed the same concept independently, which tells you something about how fundamental this combination is. A single egg delivers 6 grams of protein, all 9 essential amino acids, and significant vitamin D, choline, and selenium. Medieval families who kept even a few chickens had access to one of the most nutritionally complete foods on earth. The meal took less time to prepare than it takes to microwave a frozen dinner, and it contained exactly 3 ingredients, all of which a peasant could name. Number 13. Bread and ale soup, also known as ale berry. Stale bread, warm ale, and a dash of honey or salt. The bread was crumbled into warmed ale and eaten as a thick porridge-like meal. This was a common breakfast and evening supper across medieval England and northern Europe. Ale in the medieval period was not the carbonated drink we know today. It was a low-alcohol, nutrient-rich fermented grain liquid brewed in nearly every household. The fermentation process created B vitamins, particularly folate, and made minerals from the grain more bioavailable. A 2023 study published in Foods Journal confirmed that yeast fermentation of oats produced a net folate increase of 120 nanograms per gram after just 24 hours. Medieval peasants were eating fermented grain meals every day without knowing the biochemistry. They just knew it kept them standing. Combining fermented ale with bread created a calorie-dense, easily digested meal that doubled as a probiotic delivery system. For the modern equivalent, think of it as a fermented grain bowl, centuries before the concept existed. Number 14. Rendered fat and root vegetables. Turnips or parsnips, lard or tallow, and salt. Peasants sliced root vegetables and cooked them in rendered animal fat over a low fire until soft and caramelized. The fat increased calorie density dramatically and made fat-soluble vitamins in the vegetables absorbable. This was a high-energy winter meal that could be prepared in a single pot with no special equipment. Parsnips in particular are high in potassium, fiber, and folate. Cooked in animal fat, they become one of the most nutrient-dense simple meals you can make. The entire concept of cooking vegetables in healthy fat has been rediscovered by modern nutritionists, who now recommend it as the optimal way to absorb vitamins A, D, E, and K. For your kitchen, this is the simplest winter meal you can make. 1 root vegetable, 1 fat, 1 seasoning. Done. Number 15. Honey water with bread. The simplest meal on this list and perhaps the most revealing. Bread, water, and honey. Peasants who could access even a small amount of honey would dissolve it in water and dunk bread into the mixture for a quick, energy-dense meal. Honey has a pH between 3.2 and 4.5, making it naturally antibacterial. It has an extremely low water activity, typically below 0.6, which means bacteria cannot survive in it. It does not spoil. Not in years, not in decades. Archaeologists have found edible honey in Egyptian tombs over 3,000 years old. A medieval peasant with a jar of honey had a shelf-stable sweetener, a wound treatment, a preservative, and a meal ingredient all in one. The average American now consumes 77 grams of added sugar per day, most of it hidden in processed foods. That sugar provides calories and nothing else. No enzymes, no antibacterial properties, no vitamins, no minerals. Just empty energy designed to make you want more. The medieval peasant's honey did the opposite. It provided energy and protected health at the same time. Now step back and look at what these 15 meals have in common. Every single one uses whole, unprocessed ingredients. Every one can be prepared in a single pot over a single heat source. Every one costs less than $2 in modern purchasing power. And every one delivers more nutrition per calorie than the average ultra-processed meal you can buy at a grocery store today. Medieval peasants did not use these meals in isolation. They rotated through them based on season, availability, and what the garden produced that week. Peas and greens in spring, cabbage and turnips through autumn, bean pottage and oat porridge through the long winter months, foraged wortels whenever the hedgerows provided, eggs and bread when the hens were laying. The system had built-in redundancy. If the pea crop failed, beans carried the protein load. If meat was scarce, eggs and cheese filled the gap. If grain ran low, root vegetables bridged the distance to the next harvest. No single failure could collapse the entire system. Compare that to modern dependence on a supply chain where a single disruption, a trucker shortage, a port closure, a processing plant shutdown, leaves supermarket shelves empty within days. We traded a resilient system for a fragile one. We traded meals a peasant could name for ingredient lists you need a chemistry degree to read. We traded 3-ingredient suppers cooked over a fire for frozen dinners containing 30 additives and costing 4 times as much. The real difference between a medieval peasant and a modern consumer is not access to technology. It is possession of knowledge. A medieval family knew how to turn 3 ingredients into a meal that sustained life. Most of us have forgotten how. In the year 1570, a baker named Jürgen Haveland opens a shop in the Westphalian city of Soest. He sells one product, a loaf made from cracked rye kernels and water. No yeast, no fat, no sugar, no preservatives of any kind. He loads the dough into sealed iron pans, slides them into a stone oven, and does not open the door for 24 hours. When the loaves come out, they are so dark they look like they were carved from wet earth. The texture is dense, sticky, almost like cooked grain pressed into a block. The taste is sweet, though nothing sweet has gone into the dough. Haveland wraps the loaves in linen, stacks them in his cellar, and they will still be there 6 months later. Unrefrigerated, untreated, unspoiled. That bakery is still operating today, on the same street in Soest, still baking the same bread, still following the purity rule Jürgen Haveland established over 450 years ago. Today we are going to show you how that was possible. The grain that resists decay, the fermentation that kills mold before it starts, and the 24-hour bake that transforms raw rye into something chemically closer to preserved meat than to bread. Because this loaf was not primitive peasant food. It was the most sophisticated preservation system ever applied to a grain. Haveland did not invent this bread. He inherited a tradition that had been developing across northern Germany for centuries. The bread he baked, what we now call Westphalian pumpernickel, first appears in written records around 1450, but its origins almost certainly reach further back. To understand why this bread existed and why it worked, you need to understand what was growing in the fields of medieval Westphalia. And what was growing was rye, not by choice, by necessity. The soils of Westphalia, Lower Saxony, and the North German plain are sandy, acidic, and poor in nutrients. Wheat will not thrive there. Barley struggles, but rye grows in conditions that would kill most cereal crops. It germinates at temperatures as low as 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius. It tolerates drought, frost, and acidity that other grains cannot survive. By the early medieval period, rye had become the dominant grain across most of northern Europe, from the Baltic coast to the Rhine. It was the grain of the poor, and it had properties that nobody fully understood until modern food science caught up. Rye is not wheat. That sounds obvious, but the differences between these two grains run far deeper than taste or colour. Wheat gets its baking power from gluten, long elastic proteins that trap gas and create the light, airy crumb of a white loaf. Rye has almost no functional gluten. What it has instead are pentasans, complex polysaccharides, a type of plant fibre that behave in ways no other common grain can match. Research published in the journal Food Research International confirmed that pentosans can absorb up to 10 times their own weight in water. When you bake with rye, these molecules lock moisture inside the crumb so completely that the bread stays dense, heavy, and wet for weeks. This is not a flaw. This is the foundation of the entire preservation system. Mold and bacteria need free water to grow, water that is available at the molecular level, not just present inside the bread. Pentosans bind that water so tightly that even though a rye loaf feels moist to the touch, the water activity inside the crumb drops below the threshold where most spoilage organisms can function. A wheat loaf dries out in days because its gluten network releases moisture into the surrounding air. A rye loaf holds its water like a sponge that refuses to be wrung out. Studies on rye bread chemistry have shown that pentosan-rich rye breads maintain significantly higher moisture content than wheat breads, while simultaneously having lower water activity, the specific measure of free water available to microorganisms. That difference alone extends shelf life from days to weeks. But pentosans were only the first layer of the system. The second was fermentation, and medieval German bakers understood this step with a precision that modern researchers are only now documenting. Traditional pumpernickel dough was fermented using a sourdough culture, a living colony of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria maintained in wooden troughs, fed daily, and kept alive across generations. The bacteria in a rye sourdough produce two acids that are critical to preservation. Lactic acid lowers the pH of the dough, creating an environment too acidic for most spoilage organisms. Acetic acid, the same compound that makes vinegar, acts as a direct antifungal agent. Together, these acids drop the bread's pH to around 4.0 to 4.5, a range where mold growth is severely inhibited. A 2025 study published in the journal Foods, led by researchers at Kaunas University of Technology in Lithuania, screened lactic acid bacteria isolated from sourdough and found that certain strains, particularly Lactobacillus plantarum, exhibited antifungal inhibition rates between 73% and 96%. The sourdough bacteria are not just making the bread rise, they are producing a chemical environment that is actively hostile to every organism that would cause the loaf to rot. Medieval bakers did not know the word lactobacillus. They did not understand pH, but they understood that a well-maintained starter produced bread that lasted, and a neglected one produced bread that did not. The knowledge was empirical, accumulated across centuries, and passed from master baker to apprentice through guild systems that regulated every aspect of bread production in medieval German cities. A baker who sold underweight or adulterated bread could be fined, publicly shamed, or have his oven destroyed. The sourdough culture itself was treated as a valuable asset. Some bakeries maintained continuous cultures for decades, feeding them daily, keeping them at stable temperatures, protecting them the way a brewer protects a yeast strain. The culture was the bakery's competitive advantage. Lose it, and you lost the flavour, the rise, and the preservation power that made your bread worth buying. There is another benefit to extended sourdough fermentation that modern bread skips entirely. Whole rye contains phytic acid, an anti-nutrient that binds to minerals like iron, zinc, and calcium, making them unavailable for absorption in the human gut. Bread made with commercial instant yeast and a 2-hour rise retains most of its phytic acid intact. Bread made with sourdough and given 12 to 24 hours of fermentation breaks down nearly all of it. The enzymes activated by the acidic environment of sourdough, phytases, require time to do their work, and the long, slow fermentation of traditional pumpernickel gave them exactly that. The bread was not just more durable than a quick-risen loaf, it was more nutritious. The minerals locked inside the rye grain were freed and made available to the body. A peasant family eating pumpernickel through the winter was getting iron, zinc, magnesium, and B vitamins in a form their bodies could actually use. Now let's talk about what happened inside the oven, because this is where the bread crossed from preserved food into something closer to engineered material. Traditional Westphalian pumpernickel was baked for 16 to 24 hours in a sealed, lidded pan at approximately 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 120 degrees Celsius. That temperature is too low to form a crust. It is too low to brown bread in the conventional sense. but it is exactly the right temperature for the Maillard reaction to work slowly and deeply through the entire loaf over the course of a full day. The Maillard reaction occurs when amino acids and reducing sugars are exposed to heat. In a normal loaf of bread, this reaction happens fast and only on the surface. That is what creates a golden brown crust in 30 to 45 minutes of baking. Inside a sealed pan at low temperature, the reaction proceeds through the entire mass of the bread for up to 24 hours. The result is a loaf that is uniformly dark brown to black, not from burning or colouring agents, but from melanoidins, large complex brown polymers created by the Maillard reaction. These melanoidins give pumpernickel its characteristic colour, its sweetness, and its flavour notes of dark chocolate, coffee, and roasted malt. No sugar has been added. The sweetness comes entirely from the slow thermal breakdown of the rye's own starches into simple sugars, which then react with amino acids to produce compounds that taste sweet on the human tongue. The sealed pan is critical. Without it, the moisture inside the bread would escape as steam during the first few hours, the loaf would dry out, and the Maillard reaction would stop. The lid traps the steam, maintaining a humid environment inside the pan that keeps the internal temperature stable and the chemistry active for the full baking period. It functions as a slow autoclave, a sealed, moist, low-temperature chamber where chemical reactions that would take minutes at high heat are allowed to unfold across hours. The German company Mestermacher, founded in 1871 in Gütersloh, Westphalia, and producing pumpernickel since 1910, bakes their loaves at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius, in a pressurized steam chamber for at least 20 hours. They describe their process as closer to cooking than baking. Their sealed pumpernickel, made without any preservatives, has a verified shelf life of over 2 years. The melanoidins do more than create colour and flavour. Research in food chemistry has demonstrated that Maillard reaction products possess both antioxidant and antimicrobial properties. Studies have identified a compound called pronal lysine, an antioxidant produced during slow baking that concentrates in the bread's outer layers at up to 8 times the level found in the interior crumb. These melanoidins create an internal chemical environment that is hostile to both mold and bacteria, a third preservation mechanism layered on top of the water binding and the sourdough acidity. So the complete system worked like this. Pentosans bound the water, denying mold the free moisture it needed to grow. Sourdough fermentation produced organic acids that dropped the pH below the threshold for most spoilage organisms. Specific lactic acid bacteria generated antifungal compounds that attacked mold directly. And the 24-hour Maillard reaction produced melanoidins that added antimicrobial protection while transforming the bread's chemistry from the inside out. 4 independent preservation mechanisms, all operating simultaneously, all produced by nothing more than rye, water, a sourdough culture, and time. No single mechanism would have been enough on its own. Pentosans without acidity would slow mold but not stop it. Acidity without water binding would work for weeks but not months. The Maillard reaction without the other 3 would produce dark bread that still spoiled. It was the combination, the complete system, that created a loaf capable of lasting half a year in a cellar with no technology beyond a linen wrapping. The practical implications were enormous. In a world without refrigeration, without canning, without vacuum sealing, bread that lasted 6 months was not a convenience. It was survival infrastructure. Northern German winters were long and the growing season was short. A family that could bake enough pumpernickel in autumn to last until spring had a food supply that did not depend on daily access to a baker, a functioning grain market, or a stable economy. The bread was calorie-dense, roughly 65 calories per slice, with significant fibre and minerals from the whole rye grain. It could be stored in cellars, root stores, or any cool dry space without special treatment. It travelled without spoiling on carts, in saddlebags, on ships. The German military recognised this early. Pumpernickel became a standard field ration precisely because it survived conditions that destroyed wheat bread in days. Soldiers carried loaves wrapped in cloth that remained edible weeks after leaving the bakery. Sealed in tin cans with no preservatives, no vacuum treatment, and no chemical additives, pumpernickel lasted over 2 years. The canning simply added a moisture barrier on top of an already self-preserving system. For a medieval family, for a travelling merchant, for an army on the march, this bread solved the most fundamental problem of pre-industrial life: how to keep food from rotting before you could eat it. The bread also held a unique position in German culture. In 2014, UNESCO inscribed German bread culture on its intangible cultural heritage list, recognizing a tradition that encompasses over 3,200 registered bread varieties according to the Deutsches Brotinstitut. Pumpernickel is among the oldest of those varieties, and unlike many traditional foods that survive as museum pieces or festival curiosities, pumpernickel never stopped being baked. The Haverland Bakery in Soest has been producing it continuously since 1570. Under European Union protected designation rules, bread sold as Westphalian pumpernickel must be produced entirely within Westphalia, from mixing the dough to the final bake. The process, the grain, and the region are legally inseparable. Compare this to what sits on your grocery shelf. The average commercial sandwich bread in the United States contains between 15 and 25 ingredients, including calcium propionate to inhibit mold, sodium stearoyl lactylate as a dough conditioner and mono, and diglycerides as emulsifiers. Even with all of that chemical engineering, it lasts about 5 to 7 days before mold appears. Bread is the single most wasted food category in America. 38% of all grain products are thrown away every year. In Germany, bakery waste accounts for nearly 35% of total baked goods production. We produce bread that is designed to be eaten within days and discarded when it is not. Medieval German bakers produced bread that was designed to last through a season and sustain a family through winter. The chemistry has not changed. Rice still contains pentosans. Lactic acid bacteria still produce organic acids. The Maillard reaction still operates at 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 120 degrees Celsius. Every mechanism that made this bread last 6 months in 1450 is still available today. The difference is time. Traditional pumpernickel requires 24 hours in an oven. No modern commercial bakery will dedicate an oven for an entire day to produce a single batch of bread, when the same oven could turn out dozens of batches of white bread in the same period. Speed replaced durability. Throughput replaced shelf life. And we traded a loaf that lasted 6 months for a loaf that lasts 6 days, and a chemical ingredient list that takes a full paragraph to read. If you want to bake this bread yourself, the process is simple in concept and demanding only in patience. You need whole rye berries, not rye flour, but the intact kernel, coarsely cracked. You need water and a pinch of salt. The rye berries are soaked in hot water overnight. If you have a rye sourdough starter, add a portion to accelerate fermentation. If you do not, the wild bacteria present on the grain and in the air will begin the process on their own. It will simply take longer. After 12 to 24 hours of fermentation, pack the dough tightly into a lidded loaf pan, leaving no air gaps. Bake at 300 degrees Fahrenheit, 150 degrees Celsius, for the first 45 minutes to bring the internal temperature up, then reduce to 220 degrees Fahrenheit, 105 degrees Celsius, and leave it for 16 to 24 hours. Do not open the lid. The steam trapped inside is doing the work. What comes out will be nearly black, dense enough to slice paper thin, and sweet without any added sugar. Wrapped tightly and stored in a cool, dark place, it will keep for months. The Haviland purity rule, rye and water, nothing more, held for over 4 centuries. It was not a marketing decision. It was the recognition that adding anything to this bread was unnecessary. The rye provided the structure, the water binding, and the sugars for the Maillard reaction. The sourdough provided the acid barrier and the antifungal defense. The oven provided the time and the low heat for the chemistry to finish the job. 3 inputs, 4 preservation mechanisms, 6 months of shelf life, and not a single ingredient that a medieval peasant could not find within walking distance of his own field. We did not improve on this system. We abandoned it because it was slow. And then we spent the next century trying to engineer, with laboratories and chemical additives, what rye and thyme had already solved. Medieval bakers knew a secret about sourdough that's making modern bread destroy your gut. Every slice of supermarket bread today takes 45 minutes to make. Medieval bread took 24 hours. And that missing time is why millions of us now suffer from bloating, inflammation, and gluten sensitivity that our ancestors never had. Because during those 24 hours, something happened in the dough. Medieval bakers, without knowing it, were using bacteria to disarm a chemical weapon hidden inside every grain of wheat. A weapon that modern bread still has, but medieval bread didn't. Today, we're reopening the medieval bakery, because the solution to your gut health isn't in a modern lab. It's been sitting in the 13th century this whole time. England, 1266. A baker is being dragged through the streets on a wooden sledge. His hands are tied. His face is covered in flour and shame. Crowds are jeering at him from every direction. His crime? He sold a loaf of bread that was 3 ounces underweight. Now, you might think that's insane. It's just bread. But here's what you need to understand. In medieval Europe, if you took away the bread, society didn't just get hungry, it collapsed entirely. Bread was 70% of a peasant's daily calories. Every single day, they ate 2 to 3 pounds of dense, dark loaves. That's why the English government passed the Assize of Bread and Ale in 1266, a law that didn't just regulate the price of bread, but the quality. And the punishments were brutal. Because when a baker rushed the process, when he skipped the fermentation trying to save time, he wasn't just cheating on weight, he was producing a heavy, doughy brick that would sit in people's stomachs like a stone. And when your entire workforce is eating indigestible bricks, productivity tanks, people get sick, the economy suffers. That's why the punishment was so severe. But here's where it gets interesting. To prevent this disaster, to make sure the bread was actually digestible, medieval bakers needed help. They couldn't do it alone. So every morning, they walked next door to the brewery, and they borrowed a bucket of something that looked like toxic sludge. On top of every fermenting beer barrel sat a thick, frothy foam, brown, smelly, the kind of substance that, if you saw it today, you'd assume it was contaminated and dump it down the drain. Medieval bakers called it balm, and they treated it like liquid gold. The smell would hit you first. Yeast, fermentation, that sharp tang of carbon dioxide mixed with grain. In winter, bakers would take warm balm straight from active fermentation. In summer, they'd let it cool first. The foam was alive. You could see it bubbling, moving and breathing. They'd carry that bucket of foam back to the bakery and mix it directly into their flour. No measuring, no sterilization, just raw, living foam straight from the brewery into the bread. Because hidden inside that disgusting foam were billions of wild yeast cells and lactobacillus bacteria, an entire living ecosystem. And when the baker mixed that foam into his flour and water, something magical happened. The yeast started eating the sugars in the flour, producing gas that made the dough rise. That's the part you learned about in school. But the lactobacillus bacteria, They were doing something far more important, something medieval bakers didn't even know was happening. They were disarming a hidden toxin inside the wheat itself. A toxin that your body can't digest. A toxin that's still in your bread today. So what was this hidden toxin the bacteria were fighting? It's called phytic acid, and every grain of wheat is loaded with it. Here's why. Wheat is a seed, and like all seeds, it doesn't want to be eaten. It wants to survive long enough to become a plant. So nature built a defense system. Phytic acid acts like a bodyguard for the seed's nutrients. When you eat wheat, this compound grabs onto minerals, iron, zinc, magnesium, and locks them up. Your body can't access them. So even if you're eating a nutrient-rich diet, the phytic acid is starving you from the inside. And here's the problem. Your stomach can't break this compound down. You have no weapon against it. But lactobacillus bacteria do. During those 12 to 24 hours of fermentation, the bacteria slowly dismantle the phytic acid molecule. They produce acid that breaks down the compound piece by piece. By the time the medieval baker put his loaf in the oven, the defense system was destroyed. The nutrients were unlocked. Now look at modern bread. Factory bread rises in 45 minutes. The bacteria don't even have time to wake up, let alone fight. So when you eat that slice of supermarket bread, the phytic acid is still active, still locking up nutrients, still sitting in your gut like a thief that never got caught. Medieval peasants ate pre-digested bread. We are eating a safe with a lost combination. The only difference? Time. But the bacteria weren't the only secret to their iron stomachs. There was something else in that medieval bakery, something we'd consider contaminated today, that was actually protecting their digestion. Walk into a medieval bakery and you'd see a massive wooden trough, scarred, cracked, stained dark from decades of use, maybe 50 years old, maybe older. By modern standards, that trough would be condemned. Health inspectors would shut the place down. Those cracks are breeding grounds for harmful germs, right? Wrong. Those cracks were home to a living colony of beneficial bacteria, what scientists call a biofilm. Every time the baker kneaded dough in that old trough, the wood transferred good microorganisms directly into the bread. The trough was more than a tool. It was an ingredient. Because the baker never sterilized it. He scraped it clean, yes, but he didn't bleach it. He didn't kill the bacteria. And that's exactly what made the bread digestible. If you ran your hand along that wood, you'd feel grooves worn smooth by thousands of kneading sessions. The grain of the wood darkened where dough had been pressed into it year after year. In some bakeries, the trough was older than the baker himself, passed down from father to son. The wood itself had memory. It remembered every batch, every culture, every strain of bacteria that had ever lived in its cracks. Now walk into a modern bakery. Stainless steel, glass, sanitizer everywhere. We've created environments so sterile that no bacteria can survive, not even the ones that would help break down your food. We won the war on germs, but we lost something in the process. We eliminated the invisible workforce that used to pre-digest our bread before we even ate it. But the wood and the bacteria still weren't enough. You needed the right grain. And if a medieval peasant saw a bag of modern flour, he wouldn't even recognize it as food. Because medieval flour wasn't pure white powder. It was darker, coarser, and it wasn't just wheat. Most peasants ate bread made from maslin, a mix of wheat and rye grown together in the same field. Farmers didn't separate them. They harvested them together, milled them together, baked them together. This wasn't laziness. This was a survival strategy. If the weather turned bad for wheat, the rye would survive. If disease hit the rye, the wheat would carry the crop. It was an insurance policy against famine. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, summer rains destroyed the wheat harvest. Entire fields rotted in the ground, but the rye survived. Farmers who had planted maslin lost half their crop, but harvested the other half. Farmers who planted only wheat lost everything, and starvation followed. Over 3 years, an estimated 5 to 10% of the population died. The survivors were those who had mixed their grains. Maslin was the difference between life and death. But mixing wheat and rye did something else, something the farmers didn't even understand. Rye is enzymatically supercharged. It ferments faster and more aggressively than wheat. By mixing rye into the dough, medieval peasants guaranteed a strong, active fermentation. The rye acted like rocket fuel for the bacteria. More fermentation meant more phytic acid breakdown. More gluten breakdown meant better digestion. Now look at modern wheat. In the 1960s, scientists created dwarf wheat, short, stubby, and high yield. They designed it for combine harvesters and factory efficiency, not human digestion. And they stopped mixing grains, pure wheat, every time. So modern bread lost the rye's enzymatic power, lost the mixed grain resilience, lost the fermentation boost. We didn't just change the grain, we removed the natural amplifier that made medieval fermentation so effective. But losing the grain mix was just the beginning. Because in 1961, everything fell apart. It's the year bread died. Scientists in Chorleywood, England, gathered in a lab. Their mission? Solve a problem that had plagued bakers for thousands of years. Fermentation takes too long. 24 hours from flour to loaf were unacceptable. Too slow. Too expensive. So they invented a machine that would change bread forever. The Chorleywood bread process uses industrial mixers so violent they don't just knead dough, they beat it into submission. Under intense pressure, the mixers force gas into the dough in minutes, not hours. Add chemical dough conditioners, extra yeast and solid fats, and you can skip fermentation entirely. From raw flour to plastic-wrapped loaf in 3 hours. Not 24 hours, not 12 hours. 3. And when this process hit factories, profits exploded. Bakeries could use cheaper, lower-protein wheat that traditional bakers couldn't touch. They could pump out thousands of loaves per hour instead of hundreds. In the UK, Chorleywood bread captured 80% of the market in just a few years. But there was a cost. Medieval bread was naturally acidic. The bacteria produced acid during fermentation. That acid prevented mold. Medieval loaves could sit on a shelf for weeks without spoiling. They had a built-in immune system. Chorleywood bread? No fermentation means no acid. Mold loves it. So the industry added chemical preservatives, calcium propionate to kill mold, emulsifiers to keep it soft, dough conditioners to make it white. We replaced 24 hours of biology with a cocktail of chemicals. This is the same pattern you see everywhere. Natural immunity replaced with pills, gut bacteria replaced with probiotics, fermentation preservation replaced with chemical preservatives. They removed the biological system, then sold you a pharmaceutical replacement. Your great-grandmother's bread had probiotics built in. You're buying probiotics in a pill to fix the gut damage from bread that eliminated the probiotics. We saved time, but we destroyed the food. And now, looking at our gut health crisis, the bloating, the inflammation, the gluten sensitivity epidemic, we have to ask, was it worth it? And it gets worse. Because right now, the same industry that destroyed bread in 1961 is selling you sourdough for $7 a loaf. They know you're trying to be healthy. They know sourdough is trending. They see you searching for gut-friendly bread and digestible loaves. So they slap the word sourdough on the label, and they're charging you double. But here's the trick. They're still using the exact same Chorleywood process. Same 3-hour timeline, same chemical yeast, same violent mixers. The only difference? They add vinegar to the dough. That's it. Vinegar creates a sour taste. Your tongue thinks it's fermented, but it's not. It's flavored. The phytic acid, still there. The gluten, still unbroken. The bacteria, never existed. You're paying $7 for chemically flavored Chorleywood bread with a fancy label. Want to know if you've been scammed? Pull out a loaf right now. Read the ingredients. If you see yeast listed, it's fake. If you see vinegar or acetic acid, it's fake. Real sourdough has 3 ingredients: flour, water, salt. That's it. No yeast, no vinegar, no 15-syllable chemicals. If your sourdough has anything else, you've been paying premium prices for industrial garbage with good marketing. But here's the good news. You don't need them. And you also don't need a medieval brewery or an old stinky trough, because the main method medieval bakers used is simpler than you think and still works. Here's what medieval bakers did, and you can do it tonight. Forget the digital scales. Forget the temperature probes. Forget feeding schedules. Medieval bakers made sourdough with 3 things: rye flour, water, and their hands. Here's the method. Step 1. Mix rye flour and water into a stiff ball of dough, about the size of your fist. Doesn't need to be perfect, just firm enough to hold its shape. Step 2. Bury that ball deep inside a sack of flour, or a container of flour. The flour keeps it cool, dark, and protected. Step 3. Wait. 12 to 24 hours. When you dig it out, it should smell like overripe fruit. Sweet, slightly alcoholic. That's the bacteria working. That's the smell of fermentation that actually breaks down phytic acid. Step 4. Dissolve that fermented ball in warm water. Use that milky liquid to start your bread dough. Step 5. Before baking, pinch off a small piece of dough, roll it into a ball, bury it again for next week. Here's what to expect. After your first attempt, your starter might smell weird, like feet or nail polish remover. That's normal. The bacteria are fighting for dominance. Keep going. After days 3 to 5, the smell should shift to sour and fruity. If it smells like rotting garbage, throw it out and start over. But 9 times out of 10, it'll work. After week 2, your starter is now established. It'll smell consistent, pleasantly sour. The bread will rise reliably. You can keep this culture alive for decades. Don't refrigerate your starter until it's at least 2 weeks old. Medieval bakers kept starters at room temperature. Cold storage is a modern invention that weakens young cultures. If you mess up, just start again. Flour is cheap. Your health is not. That's it. That's the entire process medieval peasants used to feed Europe for centuries. No thermometers, no precision. Just flour, water, time, and bacteria that have been waiting in the air for you to give them a chance. And here's what makes this different from that $7 fake sourdough. This actually works. The bacteria have 12 to 24 hours to break down the phytic acid. The gluten gets pre-digested. Your body can actually process it. Bread isn't the enemy. Rushed bread is. The solution to your gut health isn't in a doctor's office or a supplement bottle. It's been sitting in the 13th century waiting for you to slow down. Picture a single iron pot hanging over a low fire in a one-room English cottage, sometime around the year 1300. It has been there since before dawn. It will still be there at midnight. And it is almost never scraped empty. Whatever is inside it has a name. Pottage. That one pot was breakfast, dinner, and supper for an entire family. It cooked on almost no fuel. It needed almost no skill. It wasted almost nothing. And it stayed the everyday staple of ordinary European life for the better part of 1,000 years. Now look at how you eat. The average American family throws away around $1,500 of food a year, bought and never eaten. And more than half the calories in the average American diet, 55% of them, now come from ultra-processed products. We have refrigerators, supermarkets, and a kitchen full of appliances, and we still waste more food and eat worse than a medieval peasant working a single pot over an open fire. They had a food system, we have a food industry, and almost everything the history books tell you about that pot is wrong. It was not joyless grey gruel. It was one of the most efficient, adaptable, and genuinely nourishing food systems ever built. Today we are going to dig it back up and show you exactly how it worked in 4 parts. Part 1. What pottage actually was. Start with the word itself. Pottage comes from the old French potage, which meant very simply that which is put in a pot. The modern English word porridge is a direct descendant of it, and for centuries the two were almost interchangeable. And that origin tells you something the recipe books never say out loud. Pottage was not a dish, it was a method. It was whatever you had on hand, simmered slowly in water or stock until it turned soft, thick, and edible. That method was built around a single object, the cauldron. For a peasant household, the cooking pot was often the most valuable thing they owned. Pots were named in wills and handed down to children because a family might own exactly one. A poor household might have a single pot, one knife, and a few wooden bowls, and that one pot was expected to do everything. There was no oven. There was no second flame. There was the fire and the pot above it, and everything the family ate was cooked in there. Medieval cooks knew 2 broad kinds. Running pottage was the thinner version, closer to a soup, loose enough to drink straight from the bowl. Standing pottage was cooked down much further until it was stiff enough to hold the shape of a spoon pressed into it. Same pot, same method, different amount of patience. But knowing what pottage was does not explain the thing that actually made it work. How did one pot feed a whole family every single day on almost nothing? For that, you have to look at the fire. Part 2. The fire that never went out. Here is where pottage stops being a recipe and becomes a system. The pot was rarely emptied. A medieval household did not cook 3 separate meals a day the way we do now. The fire itself was too expensive for that. Firewood had to be gathered by hand, it took real labour, and in many regions the right to collect it was controlled by the local lord. Lighting a cooking fire from cold every few hours was a waste no working family could afford. So the fire stayed banked and the pot stayed on it day and night. The pottage inside was topped up, not thrown out. Yesterday's leftovers became the base of today's meal. A few handfuls of grain, some vegetables from the garden, more water, and the pot simply continued. There is an old English nursery rhyme almost everyone has heard without ever thinking about what it actually describes. Peas porridge, hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. That rhyme is a folk memory of this exact practice. Pottage eaten hot, then eaten cold the next day, then kept and reheated again after that. To a modern viewer, food left in a pot for days sounds dangerous, but a pot held at a steady simmer over a banked fire is, in effect, being reboiled every single day, and that constant heat held the worst of the spoilage in check. Far from careless, it was a working preservation method that cost nothing. This is the real genius of pottage. One pot fed a household with almost no waste and almost no effort. It cooked itself while the family worked the fields. It did not need watching. A young child could tend it. The whole system ran on the 2 things a peasant family had least of, fuel and time, and it spent almost none of either. It is worth holding that next to your own kitchen. By most estimates, somewhere between 30 and 40% of all the food in America is thrown away, much of it still perfectly edible. The medieval cottage, with 1 pot and 1 fire, threw away close to nothing, because it could not afford to. That was not virtue, it was design. And the next part of that design was what actually went into the pot. Part 3. What went inside? The foundation was almost always grain or legumes, and usually both. In England, that meant oats, barley, and rye, alongside dried peas and beans. Wheat was the expensive grain, the bread grain, and most peasants ate very little of it. But oats and barley grew willingly in poor soil and cold weather, where wheat would fail, and dried peas and beans stored for months and dropped into the pot whenever they were needed. Peas pottage, dried peas cooked down into a thick, dense paste, was so universal that its name became shorthand for plain, humble, everyday food. On top of the grain went the vegetables, and here the medieval household used a word we have almost entirely lost. They were called worts, or pot herbs. Cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, kale, and whatever leafy greens the season offered. Most cottages kept a small garden for exactly this. In Old English, that plot was sometimes called a leek tun, literally a leek enclosure, because leeks and onions were the hardiest, most dependable things in it. The garden fed the pot fed the family, a closed local loop running a few steps from the cottage door. Meat was the luxury layer, and for most families not a daily event. The peasant's animal was the pig, and a small piece of salted bacon could be dropped into the pot to give the whole thing fat, salt, and savoury depth without anyone eating a real portion of meat. A single piece of bacon could season a pot for most of a week. Herbs went in freely, and medieval cooks treated their pot herbs as quietly medicinal, food and remedy at the same time. And the recipe was never truly fixed because the seasons would not permit it. Spring leaned on the first young greens, summer on fresh vegetables, autumn on the full harvest, winter on stored grain and dried peas. The method never changed. What you put into it changed with the turning of the calendar. There was even a sweeter member of the family, called frumenti, whole wheat simmered slowly in milk, eaten at every level of society and served beside meat at feasts. Pottage was less a single food than an entire category, and that flexibility is a large part of why it never went out of use. So the pot was cheap, efficient, and endlessly flexible. But cheap and flexible is not the same as good for you. Was pottage actually keeping anyone healthy, or just keeping them full? Part 4. Why it kept you alive. This is the part the gruel myth gets most badly wrong. Pottage was not starvation food. For a hard-working population with no refrigeration, no supplements, and no safety net of any kind, it came remarkably close to nutritionally ideal. And modern science can now explain why. Start with the grain and legume base. Grains and legumes eaten together supply a fuller, more usable set of the proteins the human body requires than either of them provides alone. Modern nutritional science has a name for this. It is called protein complementarity, and it was only properly understood in the last few decades. A medieval peasant eating barley and peas out of the same pot was assembling a genuinely workable protein source from the two cheapest ingredients available, without the faintest idea of the chemistry. They were centuries ahead of the science, entirely by accident. Now add the worts. Cabbage, leeks, and leafy greens carry real vitamins and minerals, and because pottage was simmered slowly in a more or less closed pot, much of what cooked out of those vegetables stayed in the liquid instead of being lost. Nobody poured the goodness down a drain. The broth was the meal. The long, slow cooking did one more important thing. It broke tough, fibrous, hard-to-digest ingredients down into a form the body could actually absorb, unlocking calories and nutrients that would otherwise have passed straight through. For people doing hard physical labour from dawn to dusk, that mattered. Nothing edible was wasted, and nothing nourishing was left locked inside an ingredient the body could not open. Historians describe the medieval working diet as standing on 3 legs: pottage, bread, and ale. The bread delivered dense calories. The ale, weak and far safer to drink than much of the available water, delivered still more. And the pottage delivered the vegetables, the fibre, the protein, and the heat. Pull pottage out of that arrangement, and the whole medieval diet falls down. And here the comparison turns uncomfortable. Roughly 94% of Americans fail to eat the fibre that health authorities recommend, and the average adult gets only about half of it. A peasant eating barley, peas, and warts out of that pot was getting more fibre and more whole food nutrition in a single bowl than most modern eaters manage in a day, with a supermarket on every corner. The pottage system was not behind us. In some ways, it is still ahead of us. But who was actually eating it? The answer is not who you would expect. Pottage was not only the food of the poor, it was eaten by everyone all the way up. We have the cookbooks to prove it. The Form of Curie is a recipe collection compiled around the year 1390 by the master cooks of King Richard II of England. It is one of the most important surviving food documents of the entire medieval period, and it is full of pottage. Across the Channel, a French household manual now known as Le Ménagier de Paris, written in the early 1390s, did very much the same. Neither of these books was written for peasants. They were written for wealthy, noble, and royal kitchens, and those kitchens were producing pottage constantly. The difference was never the method. It was only the budget. A peasant's pottage was grain, warts, and a little bacon. A lord's pottage was built on exactly the same principle, then loaded with everything money could reach. Almond milk in place of plain water, real meat, sometimes several kinds in a single pot. Saffron to stain the whole thing a brilliant gold, imported pepper, ginger, and cloves. Wealthy households cooked elaborate, brightly coloured, heavily spiced pottages, gave them names of their own, and served them as a deliberate display of status. A bowl of pottage could be a humble survival meal or a piece of theatre, depending entirely on whose fire it came off. So pottage was not the bottom rung of the medieval food ladder. It was the entire ladder, running without a break from the poorest cottage fire to the king's own table. A food that flexible, eaten that widely, for that long, does not survive by accident, and it did survive, for an astonishingly long time, the everyday staple of ordinary European life for the better part of 1,000 years. Once you can see how the system actually worked, the reason is no mystery at all. Pottage solved nearly every constraint a pre-industrial household faced, and it solved them all at the same time. It needed only one pot and one fire, so it cost almost nothing in equipment or fuel. It cooked unattended, so it cost almost nothing in labour. It accepted whatever ingredients were on hand, so it did not fail when a particular crop did. It consumed leftovers instead of wasting them. It turned cheap grain and a plot of garden vegetables into a meal that genuinely nourished the people eating it. And it did all of this with no oven, no refrigeration, no training, and no written recipe to follow. Nobody had to be taught pottage. You were born into it. That is what a real food system looks like, a flexible, forgiving method that bends around scarcity instead of snapping under it. Strip out the modern kitchen, and most of us could not feed a family for a week. A medieval household did it for a lifetime, with one pot. Which raises an obvious question. If the system was that good, could you actually run it yourself? You can, and it is genuinely simple, because simplicity was the entire point. Start with your base. Take a grain, a legume, or both together. Pearl barley and dried split peas are the most authentic choices and the easiest to find. Around a cup of them, combined, will build a solid pot. Rinse them and add them to a heavy pot with plenty of water, or a light stock if you want more depth. Next come your pot herbs. Chop an onion, a leek, a couple of cloves of garlic, and a generous quantity of cabbage or kale. Beyond that, use whatever hardy vegetables you actually have. Carrots and root vegetables belong here too. Authentic pottage followed the season, so use what is genuinely around you. For the savoury layer, add a piece of bacon or a ham hock. This is the medieval move. You are not adding meat as a portion to be eaten. You are adding it as a seasoning for fat, salt, and depth across the whole pot. To keep it meat-free, a spoonful of butter and a confident hand with the salt will carry it. Then comes the only real instruction. Simmer it low and simmer it long. An hour at the absolute minimum, 2 or 3 is better. The barley and the peas should slowly collapse. The vegetables should go completely soft, and the whole pot should thicken on its own. Stir it now and then so the bottom does not catch and burn. Season it with salt and whatever herbs you like. For running pottage, stop while it is still loose enough to drink from the bowl. For standing pottage, keep going until a spoon will stand upright in it without help. Eat it with bread. And if there is any left in the pot, do exactly what they did for 1,000 years. Keep it and let it start tomorrow's pot. There's a 2-ingredient sourdough recipe that medieval bakers used for over 800 years. No proofing box, no feeding schedule, no folding every 30 minutes. The method sounds completely wrong, but it produces deeper flavour, a better crust, and bread that lasts twice as long as anything you're making right now. Meanwhile, modern sourdough has you babysitting a single loaf for 12 to 18 hours. Adjusting room temperature, watching the clock, and half the time it still comes out dense and gummy. The difference between your bread and theirs isn't skill. It isn't equipment. It's one thing that's been hiding in plain sight for 1,000 years, and the $3.6 billion artisan bread industry is counting on you never finding it. Why the modern version fails. Every sourdough recipe on the internet says the same thing. Keep your dough at 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, use a proofing box, find the warmest spot in your kitchen. That advice is not wrong, because warm temperatures do make yeast and bacteria work faster. However, faster is the entire reason your bread has problems. At 78 degrees Fahrenheit, lactobacillus bacteria, the organisms that create lactic and acetic acid in your dough, go into overdrive and produce acid so fast that the gluten network starts breaking down before the yeast has finished its job. The dough becomes slack, sticky, and hard to shape, while the flavour turns into one-dimensional sourness with no depth. Here is what nobody tells you. That sharp vinegary taste in your sourdough is not a sign of a good ferment, but a sign of a rushed one. Acetic acid, the compound that gives vinegar its bite, dominates when fermentation happens fast and warm. On the other hand, lactic acid, the milder, creamier compound that gives European sourdough its complexity, needs more time than a warm kitchen allows. Beyond flavour, warm fermentation is fragile. If your kitchen drops from 78 degrees Fahrenheit to 73 degrees Fahrenheit, the timing changes completely, and overproofing by just 45 minutes in a warm room ruins your dough entirely. That approach produces bread that stales within 48 hours, is hard to digest, and tastes the same whether you ferment for 8 hours or 12, because the flavour compounds never had time to develop. Commercial bakeries know this, which is why industrial sourdough uses added citric acid and vinegar to fake the flavour that real fermentation creates. A loaf of artisan sourdough from the grocery store contains dough conditioners, added gluten, ascorbic acid, and sometimes commercial yeast mixed in alongside the starter. The label says sourdough, but the ingredient list says otherwise. So how did medieval bakers avoid this completely? Medieval bakers didn't have the option of controlling temperature. They worked in stone buildings where the air was whatever the season gave them, and instead of fighting that reality, they used it. English manor records from the 14th century describe a bread-making rhythm that looks nothing like modern sourdough schedules. Bakers mixed their dough in the evening, placed it in the cellar or a stone alcove, shaped it the next morning, and baked it by afternoon. That amounts to 18 to 20 hours of cold fermentation with no checking, no poking, and no adjusting, because they simply walked away and let the cold do the work. This wasn't a shortcut. It was the standard method across medieval Europe for centuries. The cellars where it happened stayed between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, since stone walls and earthen floors created natural temperature stability that kept the space warmer than outside air in winter and cooler in summer. The dough sat in a steady, cool environment that slowed everything down just enough to produce remarkable bread. Modern science has confirmed what these bakers knew through generations of observation. In 2003, researchers at the Technical University of Munich published a study in the journal Trends in Food Science and Technology showing that doughs fermented at lower temperatures between 39 degrees Fahrenheit and 50 degrees Fahrenheit produced bread with a more complex flavour profile, better crumb structure, and longer shelf life than doughs fermented warm. A 2012 study from the University of Alberta, published in the International Journal of Food Microbiology, went further and found that cold fermented sourdough had a higher ratio of lactic acid to acetic acid, which is the difference between bread that tastes balanced and creamy versus bread that tastes sharp and aggressive. Medieval bakers did not know the chemistry, but through centuries of trial and error, they perfected a technique that modern food science is only now catching up to, and the technique is remarkably simple. Mix your dough, make it cold, walk away. And the proof is not limited to France. In Germany, the tradition of Sauerteig, literally sourdough, relied on cold overnight proofs in unheated stone bakeries for centuries. In Scandinavia, rye sourdough was fermented in cold root cellars for up to 3 days before baking into dense flatbreads called a knäckebröd that lasted months. Across the Alps, Swiss and Austrian mountain bakers mixed dough and set it in cold outbuildings at 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, producing bread dense enough to carry through mountain passes and durable enough to last weeks. This was not one culture's trick, but a continent-wide practice that lasted over 700 years. The applied science. The key principle behind cold fermentation is selective fermentation. Your sourdough starter contains 2 groups of organisms, wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria, and at warm temperatures between 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, both groups are active at the same time, competing for the same sugars in a chaotic race of fast gas production and fast acid production, where everything happens at once and nothing develops fully. However, drop the temperature to 38 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit and something changes. The yeast slows down dramatically because wild yeast is temperature sensitive and at 39 degrees Fahrenheit barely active. But lactobacillus bacteria keep working slowly and steadily, still breaking down sugars, producing lactic acid, and developing flavour compounds at a pace that allows complexity to build. The bacteria have time to produce aromatic compounds, esters, aldehydes, and organic acids that simply do not form in a 6-hour warm proof, and these are the flavour molecules that give traditional European sourdough its depth. Here is what makes this remarkable. During cold fermentation, enzymes called proteases and amylases continue breaking down proteins and starches in the flour even while the yeast rests. Proteases snip gluten proteins into smaller pieces, which in controlled amounts actually makes the dough easier to digest. At the same time, amylases break complex starches into simple sugars that feed the Maillard reaction during baking, the chemical process that creates the golden brown crust and the caramel-like sweetness in well-made bread. A warm fermented loaf does not have time for this enzymatic breakdown because the oven stops the process before it finishes. On the other hand, a cold fermented loaf has time for the enzymes to do their full work, resulting in bread with a thinner, crispier crust, a more open and even crumb, and a flavour that has layers instead of just sourness. And here is the number that matters most. A 2017 study from the University of Eastern Finland, published in the journal Food Chemistry, found that sourdough fermented at cold temperatures for 48 hours showed a 60% greater reduction in phytic acid, the anti-nutrient that blocks mineral absorption, compared to the same dough fermented warm for 8 hours. Cold fermentation does not just taste better, but makes the bread more nutritious. Beyond nutrition and flavor, cold fermentation also improves the physical handling of dough. At 39 degrees Fahrenheit, gluten tightens and the dough firms up, so that slack, sticky mess that spread all over your counter during warm fermentation holds its shape after 24 hours in the fridge, scores cleanly, and transfers into the Dutch oven without sticking or deflating. Professional bakers call this cold strength, and it is the reason that bakeries produce the best artisan loaves in the world. Why we stopped? The method did not fail but got replaced by something faster and more profitable. The first force was commercial yeast. In 1868, the Fleischmann brothers started selling standardized compressed yeast in the United States, and by the early 1900s, commercial yeast had spread across Europe and North America. It was a genuine revolution because commercial yeast is fast, predictable, and requires no skill to use, turning a loaf that took a medieval baker 24 to 36 hours into a 3 to 4 hour product, which for a commercial bakery is the difference between baking 1 batch per day and baking 6. The second force was central heating. Once bakeries were heated to 70 degrees Fahrenheit and above year-round, there was no cold environment left to ferment in, and the seasonal rhythm that medieval bakers worked within, warm summers producing faster loaves and cold winters producing slow fermented bread, disappeared entirely. Every day became a warm day, which means fast fermentation, less flavour, less nutrition, shorter shelf life, but more loaves per hour. To be fair, commercial yeast solved real problems by giving consistent results to bakers who did not have the skill to maintain a sourdough culture, and it fed growing cities that needed bread faster than traditional methods could supply. Not because the old way was better, but because the new way was faster, and in a market economy, faster wins. However, the knowledge did not disappear everywhere. In parts of rural France, Germany, and Scandinavia, village bakers continued using cold fermentation into the 20th century. Chad Robertson, founder of Tartine Bakery in San Francisco, built his entire method around extended cold fermentation after studying with traditional bakers in the French countryside, and his first book, published in 2010, helped restart a movement. Today, artisan bakers like Tartine, Poilane, in Paris operating since 1932, and dozens of micro-bakeries across Europe are returning to what medieval bakers considered normal. And you can do this yourself, in your own kitchen this weekend. You do not need a proofing box, though a Dutch oven helps. All you need is flour, water, a sourdough starter, and your refrigerator. The final dough contains 2 ingredients, flour and water. Your starter is just more flour and water that has been colonized by wild yeast and bacteria, so the entire process comes down to grain and liquid. Materials: 500 grams of bread flour, either whole wheat or a mix of 80% white bread flour and 20% whole wheat, since whole wheat ferments faster because it contains more enzymes and natural sugars. 375 grams of room temperature water, which is 75% hydration. If you want to keep it simple, use a kitchen scale, or if you don't have one, it's about 1 2/3 cups of water to 4 cups of flour. 100 grams of active sourdough starter. If you don't have one yet, you can build it with just flour and water in 5 to 7 days, but that's a different video. 10 grams of salt, about 2 teaspoons. Step 1. Mix the dough. Combine the flour and water in a large bowl and stir until no dry flour remains, which takes about 2 minutes. The dough will look rough and shaggy, and that's exactly right. Don't knead it and don't touch it again. Just cover the bowl with a plate or damp towel and let it sit for 30 minutes. This rest period is called autolyse, and during these 30 minutes the flour absorbs the water while the gluten starts forming on its own. When you come back, the dough will look smoother and more cohesive because the proteins have been hydrating without any work from you. Step 2. Add the starter and salt. After 30 minutes, add the 100 grams of starter and 10 grams of salt on top of the dough. Squeeze it in with your hands and fold the dough over itself a few times until everything is mixed through, which takes about 3 minutes. The dough will feel sticky and uneven, and that's normal. One common mistake to avoid: do not add the salt directly to the starter before mixing, because salt slows down fermentation, and if it sits in direct contact with the starter, it can weaken the yeast before it even gets into the dough. Instead, add them to the dough at the same time but on opposite sides of the bowl. Step 3. Do 1 or 2 stretch and folds, then walk away. 30 minutes after mixing, grab one side of the dough, stretch it up, fold it over the top, turn the bowl 90 degrees, and repeat for all 4 sides. This is the golden trick of cold fermentation. You are replacing kneading with time. 1 or 2 sets of gentle folds is all the structure this dough needs because the 16 to 20 hours of cold rest will develop the gluten for you. Step 4. Put the dough in the cold and ignore it. Cover the bowl and place it in the coldest spot you have. Anywhere between 38 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit will work. Leave it alone for 12 to 20 hours. At 38 to 40 degrees, the dough can safely sit for up to 48 hours and keep improving, while at 50 to 55 degrees, the sweet spot is 12 to 18 hours. The warmer the environment, the shorter the ferment. The cooler the environment, the longer it can go. Step 5. Shape the dough the next morning. Tip the dough onto a lightly floured surface. Shape it into a round by folding the edges toward the center, then flipping it over so the smooth side faces up and gently dragging it toward you on the counter to create surface tension. After that, place the shaped dough into a floured bowl or banneton with the seam side up, cover it, and put it back in the cold for 1 to 2 hours. This final cold proof firms up the shape and makes scoring easier. Step 6. Bake. Preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit with a Dutch oven inside and let it heat for a full 45 minutes. Take the dough straight from the refrigerator, turn it out onto parchment paper and score the top with a razor blade or sharp knife in one decisive cut about ½ inch deep. Lower it into the Dutch oven and cover with the lid. Bake covered for 30 minutes, then remove the lid and bake uncovered for another 15 to 20 minutes until the crust is deep golden brown. As the loaf cools, you will hear it crackling, which bakers call singing, because it means the crust is shattering as steam escapes. Common mistake: do not cut into the bread for at least 1 hour after baking because the interior is still cooking from residual heat, and cutting too early releases steam that leaves you with a gummy crumb. What to expect? Your first loaf will not be perfect, as the shape might be uneven and the scoring might tear instead of bloom, but the flavour will be different from anything you've made with the warm fermented method, with a thinner and crispier crust, a more even crumb, and a flavour that is milder but deeper with less vinegar and more complexity. After your 3rd or 4th loaf, you will start dialing in the timing: 24 hours for a mild, sweet bread, 48 hours for something with more tang and character, and 72 hours for a deeply sour, complex loaf with maximum flavour development. After a month, you will not go back to warm fermentation because the schedule is easier, the results are better, and the bread lasts 4 to 5 days on the counter instead of 2. A £2 loaf of artisan cold fermented sourdough at a bakery costs $8 to $12, while your homemade version costs under $2 in flour, water and salt, with no proofing box needed and no special equipment beyond a Dutch oven that you buy once and keep for decades. The math is simple. The medieval baker with his stone cellar and bag of flour wasn't primitive. He was an engineer who understood that bread needs time, not technology. We forgot that, And we traded patience for speed only to end up with bread that's harder to make and worse to eat. You don't need a proofing box, a thermometer, or a feeding schedule printed on a laminated card. You need flour, water, and the willingness to walk away and let time do what it's been doing for 1,000 years. A medieval peasant in 14th century England did not have a pantry, a refrigerator, or a gas station half a mile down the road. And yet when he was working 12 hours in the field and needed something between meals, he had more snack options than the average American vending machine. Every one of them was made from something he or his wife or his neighbour produced, preserved, or foraged themselves. Zero cost, zero packaging, and a nutritional density that would embarrass anything sold in a crinkly wrapper today. Convenience food has existed for thousands of years. It just used to be real food. These are the 15 snacks that kept a farmer fueled through a 16-hour harvest day. A rotating system so well engineered for storage, nutrition, and portability that a $270 billion industry had to bury every last one of them to sell you a bag of flavoured cornstarch instead. Number 1. The dried apple ring. Take an apple, core it, slice it 1/8 of an inch thick, about 3 millimeters. String the slices on a cotton thread and hang them near the hearth until leathery and chewy. By 3800 BCE, Swiss lake settlements along Lake Zurich were already preserving apples in smokehouses that maintained fruit quality for up to 18 months. By the medieval period, dried apple rings were one of the most common stored foods in Northern Europe. A single household apple tree could produce enough dried fruit to last from September through April. The drying concentrates natural sugars and fibre, while removing only water. A cup of dried apple rings delivers about 209 calories and 3 grams of fibre, with enough natural sweetness to feel like candy. Compare that to a bag of gummy bears from the gas station. Same calories, delivered through corn syrup, gelatin, and artificial dyes. The medieval version is simpler, cheaper, and nutritionally superior. For your kitchen, core and slice 3 apples, hang the slices over a radiator for 3 to 5 days and store them in a glass jar. You will eat them for the next 3 months. Number 2. Quince preserved in honey. A quince is a hard, tart fruit that is almost inedible raw. But when you stew it in hot honey, the tannins neutralize and the result is a sticky, intensely flavored confection that lasts months without refrigeration. The Roman cookbook of Apicius, compiled in the late 4th century, gives recipes for stewing quince with honey. By the medieval period, quince paste was a staple across Europe. Cotignac in France, Cotogna in Italy, Can de Membrillo in Spain. Honey preserves it because its pH sits between 3.2 and 4.5, and its water activity falls below 0.6, making it hostile to bacteria. A peasant with a quince tree and a jar of honey had a shelf-stable sweet snack that delivered fibre, vitamin C, and antioxidants. The modern equivalent is a fruit roll-up made from corn syrup and artificial flavour. Number 3. The hazelnut. The most common nut in medieval Northern Europe. Hazelnuts grew wild across the continent, and a single October afternoon of gathering could yield enough to last months. Archaeological evidence from early medieval Ireland shows hazelnut shells at 40% of excavated sites, confirming that gathered foods remained critical even in farming societies. A 2024 study from the University of Oxford used hazelnut shell remains to reconstruct ancient woodland patterns, showing how central this nut was to everyday life. Hazelnuts contain more than 60% fat, 15 grams of protein per 100 grams, and high amounts of unsaturated fatty acids, minerals, and vitamins. A peasant cracked them with a stone, carried a handful in a belt pouch, and had portable calorie-dense fuel that required no preparation, no cooking, and no preservation. The modern equivalent is a protein bar containing whey isolate, soy lecithin, and maltodextrin. The hazelnut delivered the same macronutrients 800 years ago without a factory or a wrapper. Number 4. The roasted chestnut. In mountainous regions like the Apennines and the Cevennes, where wheat refused to grow on rocky terrain, entire communities survived on chestnuts. The tree thrived on slopes that defeated every grain crop, and chestnut flour replaced wheat flour entirely in some areas. It was called tree bread across the Mediterranean, and some mills ground nothing else. 1 cup of roasted chestnuts delivers roughly 350 calories, significant vitamin C, potassium, and magnesium, but almost none of the fat that makes other nuts so calorie-dense, making it an ideal carbohydrate source for heavy labor. Medieval market fairs sold roasted chestnuts as street food, and a peasant could roast his own in hearth ashes for nothing. Number 5. The wedge of aged hard cheese. Cheese is concentrated milk, protein, fat, and calcium compressed into a compact, transportable, shelf-stable form. Medieval monasteries became the great innovators, experimenting with aging techniques in cool cellars. Parmesan production began around 1200. Hard cheeses lasted months without refrigeration because aging removes moisture and creates conditions hostile to spoilage bacteria. Cheesemakers packed wheels in salt, submerged them in brine, or even buried pots underground. A 1 ounce, 28-gram wedge delivers about 7 grams of protein and 20% of your daily calcium. The modern protein bar costs $3 and contains 30 ingredients. The medieval cheese wedge required 1. Milk. Number 6. The curd cheese ball. Heat milk to just below boiling, stir in vinegar, strain the curds through a cloth, press with a weight, and salt. That is fresh farmer's cheese, made this way since at least the time of Homer, who describes polyphemus curdling milk in wicker strainers. Archaeologists have found clay sieves with cheese residues dating back over 7,000 years in Kujawi, Poland. In the medieval period, soft curd cheeses were a primary protein source for the working class. Pressed into rounds and allowed to dry, they hardened into portable lumps of almost pure protein that lasted days without refrigeration. 100 grams delivers roughly 11 grams of protein and 84 milligrams of calcium. For your kitchen, heat a quart of whole milk, stir in 2 tablespoons of white vinegar, strain through a cloth, press for an hour, and salt. You have just made a snack that sustained the European working class for centuries. Number 7. The trencher. A thick slab of coarse, day-old bread used as a plate. The diner placed stew or meat on top, and by the end of the meal, the bread had soaked up every drop of fat and broth. Then the trencher was eaten by the diner or given as alms to the poor. Trenchers were typically 3 to 4 days old and made from coarse whole wheat flour. Every scrap of bread served a purpose. Every drop of broth was captured. Modern food waste in the United States runs at 30 to 40% of the entire food supply, over £130 billion a year in landfills. A medieval household designed its tableware to make waste physically impossible. Number 8. The oat cake. Oats, water, and a pinch of salt. Press flat, bake on a hot stone, and you have a portable disc that survives a full day in a leather pouch. In the 14th century, French chronicler Jean Froissart documented that Scottish soldiers carried nothing but a flat metal plate and a sack of oatmeal on campaign, making cakes over fire to sustain themselves through forced marches. Oats deliver about 13 grams of protein per 100 grams dry, along with beta-glucan fiber that research from Lund University in Sweden has linked to improved cholesterol and long-lasting satiety. A modern granola bar costs $2 and contains 15+ ingredients. The oat cake contained 3 empowered men across the Scottish Highlands. For your kitchen, 1 cup of rolled oats, a pinch of salt, a tablespoon of melted butter, and enough hot water to bind. Press flat, cut into rounds, bake at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes. A month of portable snacks in a single batch. Number 9. The medieval wafer. A thin batter of flour and water pressed between two heated iron plates until crisp. By the 13th century, these oublies were eaten by all segments of society, and the oublieurs formed their own guild in Paris in 1270. A Smithsonian article documents how these medieval wafer presses evolved directly into the modern waffle iron. The first known waffle recipe appears in Le Ménager de Paris, written around 1393. As cooks gained access to new spices after the Crusades, the oubli became the gaufre, then the waffle, then the waffle. The medieval peasant ate the original without maple syrup and an Instagram photo. The fact that it evolved into a multi-billion-dollar breakfast industry tells you how sound the concept was. Number 10. The rose hip. The small red fruit of the wild dog rose contains between 300 and 1,300 milligrams of vitamin C per 100 grams, 20 to 30 times more than an orange. Medieval peasants gathered them in autumn, ate them fresh, or dried them into a paste sweetened with honey. They did not know the biochemistry. They knew rose hips kept their families healthier through winter. The proof of their importance came during World War II, when German submarines cut Britain's citrus imports and the government launched a national campaign to gather wild rose hips for vitamin C syrup, preventing an outbreak of scurvy. The exact hedgerow plant peasants had been eating for centuries became a matter of national survival. Number 11. The strip of salted dried fish. Stockfish was first recorded in the 13th century Icelandic Egil's saga, where chieftain Thorolf Kveldulfsson shipped dried cod from Norway to Britain in 875 AD. By the medieval period, stockfish accounted for most of Norway's trade income, and the Hanseatic League dominated its distribution from ports like Bergen. The preservation was simple. Split the fish, salt it, and dry it to 15 to 20% water content. The result was more than 80% protein by weight. The Christian calendar made it essential. Fast days prohibited meat but allowed fish. A peasant with a strip of stockfish in his pouch had more portable protein per ounce than any energy bar on the market today. Number 12. The cold slice of peas pudding, dried peas, water, salt, and a bit of bacon fat. Boil the peas down until they collapse. Pour into a crock, let it set overnight, and slice it in the morning. One of its earliest mentions appears in the 14th century Formia Curie. Dried peas contain over 20 grams of protein per 100 grams dry. More protein per weight than most cuts of beef. 200 grams deliver roughly 650 calories, 50 grams of protein, and 85% of your daily iron. The nursery rhyme, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old, is not a joke. It is a description of how the meal was actually consumed. Number 13. The smoked eel. Eels were the ubiquitous food for smallholders across early medieval England, nowhere more than in the Fenlands. The Domesday Book of 1086 records 77 fisheries in the Lincolnshire Fenlands paying rent in eels, some owing up to 2,500 per year. Ely itself takes its name from the Old English for eel district. A peasant smoked eels over an open fire for a day, producing slices of dense, oily fish that lasted a week. 100 grams of smoked eel delivers 289 calories, nearly 30 grams of protein, and 19 grams of fat. During Lent, when meat was forbidden, smoked eel was the fatty supplement that kept households from collapsing. Research from the University of Cambridge Department of Archaeology has confirmed the central role of freshwater fish in early medieval English diets. Number 14. Honeyed gingerbread. Medieval gingerbread was not the frosted cookie you know. It was a dense mixture of breadcrumbs and honey, flavoured with pepper or ginger, pressed into a hard, chewy slab that lasted weeks. Gingerbread fairs ran across England, France, Holland, and Germany. One Parisian abbey held a gingerbread fair continuously from the 11th to the 19th century. The Tasting History Project has reconstructed medieval recipes and confirmed the original was a shelf-stable, high-energy food quite different from the modern dessert. Honey provided natural antibacterial preservation. The spices extended shelf life further. A piece the size of a matchbox was dense enough with stored energy to fuel a working man through an afternoon. The modern energy bar sells you the same concept for $3, made with maltodextrin and palm kernel oil. Number 15. Wild garlic. Called ramsons in English, it carpets deep forest shade across Europe every spring. Medieval peasants stripped the leaves off the stem and chewed them raw for their pungent flavour. Wild garlic contains allicin, the same sulfur compound in cultivated garlic that gives it antimicrobial properties. Medieval herbalists prescribed it for colds, digestive complaints, and bad blood. Modern research has confirmed allicin has measurable antibacterial, antiviral, and antifungal activity. A handful of leaves chewed between meals was a peasant's immune booster and free snack in one. It grows in every temperate woodland in Europe, and most people walk past it every spring without recognizing it. The knowledge of which wild plants were edible used to be common. 2 generations of supermarket dependence erased it. Now step back, 15 snacks, every one shelf-stable without refrigeration, every one free of industrial sweeteners, seed oils, and preservatives. Dried fruits delivered natural sugars and vitamin C. Nuts delivered fat and protein. Dairy delivered calcium and amino acids. Oat cakes and trenchers delivered slow carbohydrates. Foraged foods delivered vitamins that cultivated food missed. Preserved proteins delivered the concentrated calories a working body needed at noon. The peasant ran a seasonal rotation of real food that outperformed the modern snack aisle on every measure except convenience. And the shelf life of the system made it work year-round without electricity, without plastic wrap, and without a chemistry lab. Here is why these 15 snacks disappeared. The food industry discovered it could take cheap commodity grains, wheat, corn, palm oil, run them through an extruder at high heat and high pressure, and sell the result for 10 or 20 times the cost of the raw ingredient. A peasant dried an apple for free. A factory takes the same apple, mixes it with sugar and artificial flavour, presses it into a fruit leather bar, wraps it in plastic, ships it across an ocean, and sells it for $3. More cost, less nutrition. The only thing the factory added was convenience, and convenience was sold to us as an upgrade when it was actually a trade-off for quality. The global snack food market was valued at roughly $266 billion in 2025. $266 billion a year on flavoured cornstarch, extruded potato flakes, and soybean oil-coated puffs. A medieval peasant spent zero on snacks and ate better. The great-grandmothers who still knew how to string apple rings, press curd cheese, and gather rose hips died, and their daughters walked past the hazel trees and the hawthorn hedges without seeing them anymore. The honest caveat is that medieval peasants also had tooth decay, occasional famine, and parasite loads we do not deal with today. Nobody is saying their lives were easy. But when they did have food, the food was better engineered for human bodies than 90% of what gets sold to you as a snack today. Their problem was quantity. Ours is quality. The 15 snacks above are the template for fixing that. Pick 3. Start this week. Your energy at 3 in the afternoon will tell you everything you need to know. You probably think of rye bread as that dense, dark loaf you see at the deli counter. Something old-fashioned, a little heavy. Maybe something your German grandmother used to eat. But for a medieval peasant in Northern Europe, rye wasn't a choice. It was the only thing standing between their family and starvation. Wheat couldn't survive in their soil. Barley barely rose when baked. Rye was the grain that grew where nothing else would. In frozen Scandinavian fields, in the sandy soil of northern Germany, in the thin dirt of the Polish lowlands. It grew through snow. It survived frost that killed every other crop. And when those peasants turned that grain into bread, they used a process so specific that modern science is only now figuring out why it worked. A fermentation method that didn't just make bread rise. It dismantled a chemical weapon hidden inside the grain itself, unlocked minerals your body couldn't otherwise absorb, and created compounds that fed bacteria in your gut that most modern bread actively starves. By the end of this video, you'll understand why medieval rye bread was more nutritious than almost anything on the bread aisle of your supermarket today, and why the method they used was abandoned not because it failed, but because it was too slow for factories. Let's start with what rye actually meant in the medieval world, because this wasn't a trendy alternative grain. This was survival itself. In most of northern Europe between the 10th and 15th centuries, rye was the dominant bread grain. South of the Alps, people ate wheat. North of the Alps, people ate rye. That line across Europe was as sharp as a border on a map. It was dictated by climate, soil, and altitude. Rye could grow in soil so poor that wheat wouldn't even germinate. It could be sown in autumn, survive under snow or winter, and be ready for harvest in early summer. For a peasant running a small subsistence farm, this was everything. If your wheat failed, you went hungry. Rye almost never failed. Bread made up 60 to 70% of a medieval peasant's daily calories. A single adult consumed 2 to 3 pounds of bread every day, not as a side dish, as the meal. Bread was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, sometimes eaten with porridge, sometimes dipped in broth, sometimes just eaten plain. When chronicles from the Great Famine of 1315 describe the collapse of European society, they're describing what happens when the bread supply fails. An estimated 10 to 15% of Northern Europe's population died in 7 years. Not from plague, from rain that wouldn't stop and grain that wouldn't ripen. So when a medieval peasant spent 3 days making a single batch of rye bread, they weren't being quaint. They were performing the single most important task in their household. And they were using a technique so precise that skipping one step would ruin everything. Here's the problem that medieval bakers had to solve, and the reason you can't just bake rye bread the way you bake wheat bread. Rye contains an enzyme called amylase. Wheat has amylase too, but wheat amylase breaks down at the temperatures inside an oven. It stops working before it can do any damage. Rye amylase is different. It stays active at much higher temperatures. And what it does is attack starch. Starch is what gives bread its structure. In wheat bread, gluten does most of the heavy lifting. It creates the stretchy framework that traps gas and makes the loaf rise. But rye has almost no usable gluten. Rye's version, called secolin, is weak, so rye bread depends on its starch and on complex sugars called pentosans to hold itself together. Now imagine what happens when you mix rye flour with water and bake it. The amylase wakes up. It starts eating the starch. The very thing holding your bread together is being dissolved from the inside. The result is a gummy, collapsed, inedible brick. Medieval bakers couldn't see enzymes. They didn't know the word amylase, but they absolutely knew what happened when they skipped the crucial step. The bread failed. And failed bread meant wasted grain that took months to grow. Their solution was acid. Lactic acid, produced by bacteria during sourdough fermentation, drops the pH of the dough. When the pH falls below about 5.5, the amylase enzyme slows down dramatically. It can't attack the starch fast enough to destroy the bread structure before the oven's heat sets it permanently. The acid doesn't kill the enzyme, it hobbles it. It buys the bread just enough time. This is why rye bread requires sourdough as a chemical necessity. Without the acid from fermentation, rye bread physically cannot hold together. Medieval bakers discovered this through centuries of trial and error, through generations of watching dough fail and figuring out what made it work. The process started with the sourdough starter, called a leaven. In medieval households across Scandinavia and northern Germany, this starter was kept alive continuously, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. A portion of fermented dough was saved from each baking session and used to start the next one. The starter contained wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria, a living ecosystem that the baker fed with flour and water. The night before baking, the baker mixed a portion of the starter with rye flour and warm water. This created what modern bakers call a sponge. It sat overnight, sometimes for 12 hours, sometimes longer. During those hours, the bacteria went to work. They consumed sugars in the flour and produced lactic acid and acetic acid. The dough became sour. The pH dropped. The amylase was neutralized. The smell would hit you before you saw it. Sharp, tangy, almost alcoholic. The surface of the sponge bubbled slowly. It rose, but not dramatically, not the way wheat dough inflates. Rye dough moves like something thick and alive. The texture is sticky, dense, almost like wet clay. You couldn't knead it the way you knead wheat bread. It would stick to your hands and never let go. The next morning, the baker added more flour, salt, and sometimes a handful of caraway seeds. The dough was mixed quickly. Rye dough doesn't benefit from long kneading because there's no gluten network to develop. Overwork it and you break down the starch structure you're trying to protect. The loaves were shaped by hand, wet hands because the dough was impossibly sticky, and placed into wooden forms or onto leaves laid on the hearthstone. In many Scandinavian households, the bread was baked in a communal oven shared by the village. You brought your dough, you waited your turn. The oven had been heated by burning wood inside it for hours, then raking out the coals and sliding the bread in. The residual heat in the stone walls did the baking. Temperatures started high, around 480 degrees Fahrenheit, and slowly fell as the stone cooled. Rye bread baked slowly, not the 25 minutes of a modern wheat loaf. A dense rye loaf might spend 90 minutes to 2 hours in that cooling oven. Some traditional pumpernickel recipes baked for up to 24 hours in a sealed tin at low temperature. That long, slow bake transformed the sugars in the rye through the Maillard reaction, producing the deep, dark, almost chocolatey flavour that defines real rye bread. When the bread finally came out, it was dark. Not the pale gold of a wheat loaf, deep brown, almost black in the thickest parts. The crust was hard and thick, sometimes a quarter inch. The interior was dense, moist and close textured. You couldn't tear it apart like a baguette. You cut it with a knife, thin slices, because the density made thick slices a workout for your jaw. This bread didn't taste like modern bread. It tasted sour, earthy, with a sweetness that came from the slow-baked sugars. It smelled like fermentation and grain and wood smoke from the oven. For a medieval peasant, this smell meant the household would eat for another week. And here's what that peasant didn't know. While they were protecting the bread from its own enzymes, the fermentation process was doing something else entirely. Something that modern science has only recently measured. Rye grain is packed with minerals: iron, zinc, magnesium, phosphorus. But those minerals are locked up. They're bound to a compound called phytic acid, sometimes called phytate. Phytic acid grabs onto minerals and holds them so tightly that your digestive system can't pry them loose. You eat the bread. The minerals pass right through you. Your body gets nothing. This is the problem with most modern whole grain bread. It contains minerals on the nutrition label, but your body can't actually absorb a large portion of them because the phytic acid hasn't been dealt with. Medieval sourdough fermentation dealt with it. When lactobacillus bacteria ferment rye flour, they produce acid. That acid activates an enzyme already present in the rye grain called phytase. Phytase does exactly what the name suggests. It breaks down phytic acid. It snaps the molecular handcuffs off the minerals and sets them free. A study published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that sourdough fermentation reduced phytic acid in whole wheat bread by 62%, compared to just 38% for standard yeast fermentation. In rye bread specifically, the results were even more dramatic. Research on traditional long-fermented rye bread showed that 99% of the phytic acid was degraded during the process. 99%. The minerals in that bread, the iron, the zinc, the magnesium, were almost entirely available for your body to use. And it gets more interesting. Researchers at the University of Eastern Finland discovered what they call the rye factor. When people ate whole grain rye bread, their bodies produced significantly less insulin than when they ate wheat bread containing the same amount of carbohydrates. Same blood sugar, less insulin. Your pancreas had to work less hard. A study published in Nature found that rye sourdough contained a wide range of gut-healthy compounds, including branched-chain amino acids and bioactive peptides that were produced specifically by the lactic acid bacteria during fermentation. Wheat sourdough had some of these compounds too, but rye had significantly more. The Frontiers in Microbiology journal published a mouse feeding study in 2022 comparing sourdough bread to standard yeast-leavened bread. The sourdough group showed lower glycemic response, increased magnesium absorption, and decreased total cholesterol and triglycerides. The researchers attributed these effects to the dietary fiber and short-chain fatty acids produced during the fermentation process. Medieval peasants who ate long-fermented rye sourdough every single day were feeding their gut bacteria a diet that modern nutritional science would consider almost ideal. They didn't know about the microbiome, but their bread was engineered by centuries of practice to work with it. So if this bread was so effective, why did we stop making it this way? The answer is the same force that killed most traditional food methods: industrial speed. Traditional rye sourdough takes 1 to 3 days from starter to finished loaf. That timeline is incompatible with industrial bread production. When the Chorleywood bread process was invented in Britain in 1961, it made it possible to go from flour to finished bread in under 3.5 hours. High-speed mechanical mixing replaced slow fermentation. Chemical additives replaced time. The bread industry could suddenly produce loaves at a speed and cost that no traditional baker could match. Rye was especially vulnerable to this shift. Because rye bread requires sourdough fermentation to function at all, you can't easily shortcut it. You can shortcut wheat bread by adding commercial yeast and dough conditioners. But rye without acid just collapses, so the industry did something simpler. It stopped making real rye bread. Most rye bread sold in supermarkets today is primarily wheat flour with a small amount of rye added for colour and flavour. The dark colour often comes from caramel colouring or molasses, not from the Maillard reaction of a long bake. The sourdough tang comes from added citric acid, not from actual bacterial fermentation. The bread looks like rye. It tastes vaguely like rye. But the fermentation process that made medieval rye bread nutritionally remarkable has been skipped entirely. The phytic acid hasn't been broken down. The minerals are still locked up. The gut-healthy compounds from bacterial fermentation were never produced. The amylase was managed by adding wheat gluten rather than by acidification. We replaced a 3-day biological process with a 3-hour industrial one, and the bread lost everything that made it worth eating in the first place. You can make real medieval-style rye bread at home. It requires patience, but the process is simpler than you think. Step 1. Build or maintain a sourdough starter using rye flour. Feed it equal parts rye flour and water by weight every day for at least 5 days until it's active and bubbly. Rye starters ferment faster than wheat starters because rye has more wild yeast and bacteria on the grain. Step 2. The night before baking, mix 100 grams of your active starter with 300 grams of whole rye flour and 300 milliliters of warm water. Stir it into a thick paste. Cover it and leave it at room temperature for 12 to 16 hours. This is your sponge. By morning, it should be bubbly and smell sharply sour. Step 3. Add 200 grams more rye flour, 10 grams of salt, and optionally a tablespoon of caraway seeds. Mix with a wet spoon or wet hands. Do not knead. The dough will be sticky and thick, more like a batter than a dough. This is normal. Step 4. Transfer the dough into a greased loaf pan. Smooth the top with a wet hand. Cover it and let it proof for 2 to 4 hours at room temperature until it rises slightly. Rye dough will never double the way wheat dough does. Step 5. Bake at 480 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes, then reduce to 350 degrees and bake for another 60 to 90 minutes. The crust should be dark and hard, the interior dense and moist. Step 6. This is the step most people skip. Let the bread cool completely, then wrap it in a cloth and wait at least 24 hours before cutting it. Rye bread needs time for the interior starches to set. Cut it too early and the inside will be gummy. This isn't a failure. It's rye being rye. What you'll end up with looks nothing like supermarket bread. It's dark, heavy and dense. A thin slice has more flavour than a thick slice of white bread. The taste is sour, slightly sweet from the long bake, earthy and deeply satisfying. One slice with butter fills you up in a way that 3 slices of modern bread can't touch. This isn't convenient. It takes 2 days from start to finish. But every hour of that process is doing something that industrial bread skips entirely. Breaking down phytic acid, producing organic acids, generating the compounds that your gut bacteria actually need. Medieval peasants baking rye bread in a village oven weren't health enthusiasts. They were survivors using the only grain that would grow in their soil and a fermentation process that was the only way to make that grain edible. They didn't know about phytase or lactic acid bacteria or the rye factor. But through centuries of observation, they built a process that modern science is only now confirming was quietly brilliant. We traded that process for speed and ended up with bread that looks like rye, but works like white flour. The knowledge isn't lost. It's sitting in your kitchen waiting for flour, water, and time.